Red Bull's 2026 engine blueprint has just leaked and it's already sending shockwaves through the paddock. What the data reveals isn't just a new power unit, but a technical gamble so extreme, it's triggered emergency responses from Ferrari, Audi, and Honda. The leak confirms Red Bull is copying Mercedes' most controversial trick but without the safety net of experience. They're pushing a combustion hack that gives them free horsepower until the FIA steps in. And here's where it turns dangerous. If a technical directive lands in January, Red Bull could lose their entire power advantage before the season even begins. Because this isn't just about legality anymore, it's about whether Red Bull's 2026 engine can survive the FIA at all. Officially, Red Bull Powertrains is ahead of schedule. That's the message they've carefully delivered in press briefings for the last 6 months. According to team leadership, development of the 2026 power unit built in-house for the first time in Red Bull's history is on track, meeting targets, and technically aligned with FIA benchmarks. But beneath the polished language, engineers around the grid have been watching one unsettling pattern. Red Bull is giving details about deadlines, but not about performance. That silence just broke. When the FIA launched preliminary reviews of 2026 hybrid unit progress earlier this year, every manufacturer was required to submit digital snapshots of their energy recovery, combustion cycle integration, and thermal behavior data. These aren't race-ready specs, they're foundational calculations, blueprints for what's coming. Most teams complied with minimal friction. Red Bull's report, however, triggered a different kind of response. Not because it was incomplete, but because it was too aggressive. Aggressive in torque delivery. Aggressive in combustion temperature. And aggressive in the way it played with a loophole the FIA hasn't yet closed. Red Bull's internal model, according to 3 separate sources with indirect access, shows an engine exploiting the grayest area of the new regulations: thermal energy exploitation through pre-combustion pressure stacking. It's not illegal. Not yet. But it's walking directly into the same philosophical zone Mercedes danced through with DAS in 2020, a mechanism that technically wasn't banned until it worked. And what's most alarming to rival teams is that Red Bull appears to be basing a core performance strategy on this exact blind spot. The FIA, for now, has issued no formal warning. No directive. No request for clarification. But that's exactly why concern is mounting. Because silence from the FIA at this stage doesn't mean approval, it means observation. And if the governing body is waiting to see how the paddock reacts before locking the language, Red Bull's current lead could be temporary. Especially now that Ferrari, Audi, and Mercedes have allegedly begun lobbying for early intervention, not with accusations, but with requests for clarification. In Formula One, that's the first quiet step before a political firefight. And here's where things get even more delicate. Unlike most other teams, Red Bull isn't partnering with an existing engine powerhouse. This is their project. Their data. Their political capital on the line. If the FIA rules against this development path in early 2025, they don't just lose a design, they lose time. And in engine cycles, time isn't recoverable. If rivals are right, and Red Bull is building their 2026 unit around an exploit that will be banned before launch, then Milton Keynes may have just wasted 24 months of technical momentum. Red Bull hasn't issued any clarification or comments since the leak. They haven't denied the design. They haven't defended it. Which only deepens the unease. Because if the data leak is accurate and the engine is indeed running borderline compression manipulation, then every hour they stay silent is either confidence or containment. They may be hoping that if they say nothing, the FIA won't act. But the risk is growing that silence will not protect them this time. And yet, no one has seen the full engine. No tests have been made public. No track sessions confirm any of the leaked behavior. Which means we're not looking at a scandal yet, we're looking at a loaded gun sitting quietly on a workbench, waiting for someone to decide whether to pick it up or shut it down. The leak didn't come from a press conference or a disgruntled ex-employee. It came from a technical presentation shared between manufacturer representatives and regulatory liaisons during a closed-door pre-season engineering summit. The document wasn't labeled confidential, but it wasn't meant for public eyes either. Inside, embedded in dense columns of data, were early efficiency models from Red Bull powertrains. At first glance, it looked like standard energy recovery projections. But several sharp-eyed engineers spotted anomalies in the thermal flow curve values that suggested heat manipulation beyond expected limits. What triggered alarm wasn't the numbers themselves, but what they implied. Red Bull appears to be attempting a hybrid combustion system that deliberately spikes pre-chamber pressure, generating a secondary compression layer just before ignition. If successful, it would produce a temporary torque surge without requiring a proportional fuel increase, giving them a free performance boost without violating the strict energy budget. Technically speaking, it's not banned. But from an engineering ethics perspective, it lands in the same space as fuel flow tricks, oil burn loopholes, and flexible wings moves that were allowed, until they weren't. Sources close to Ferrari and Audi claim that once the data was shared, teams immediately began cross-checking their own projections against Red Bull's. The conclusion? No one else is running a similar model. Not even Mercedes. Red Bull's approach isn't just advanced, it's isolated. A technical gamble they've taken alone, likely to keep their design advantage secret for as long as possible. But that isolation now makes them a target. Because when one team breaks away from the herd, and the rest smell blood, what follows isn't protest, it's strategy. And the leak may have been the opening shot. What makes this leak even more significant is how it was received. Engineers from at least 2 other teams reportedly forwarded the Red Bull model to FIA technical advisors, not with accusations, but with questions. Is this allowable? Does this comply with the spirit of the regulation? In F1, these aren't just questions, they're political instruments. Because they force the FIA to make a call. And once the governing body is asked to clarify something that hasn't been officially challenged, it creates an expectation. And if they don't act, it starts to look like complicity. Behind the scenes, Red Bull has gone into lockdown. No technical personnel are speaking on record. Internal access to their powertrain testbeds has reportedly been restricted. Communications between their UK base and US-based Ford engineering partners have been placed on encrypted channels. And that's perhaps the most revealing detail: Ford is now in the loop. Because if Red Bull's combustion gamble fails, it doesn't just hurt their car, it damages Ford's first F1 return since the V10 era. And a global brand doesn't enter this arena to be caught in a regulatory gray zone. But Red Bull's silence has created another problem: they've lost control of the narrative. Because while they stay quiet, rivals are shaping the conversation. Mercedes has allegedly requested updated clarification on pre-ignition thresholds. Ferrari wants the FIA to issue a mid-cycle technical directive. Even Honda, who rarely gets politically involved, has begun sending indirect feedback about thermal harmonization language. Each move is small, deniable, procedural. But added together, it's the build-up to something bigger. A preemptive strike before the 2026 engines even touch the asphalt. And yet, here's the real twist: no one is accusing Red Bull of cheating. Not yet. That word hasn't been used. The data doesn't prove deception. It proves intent. Ambition. A willingness to play just inside the boundary line until the boundary moves. And that's what makes this leak so powerful. Because it's not about what Red Bull has done. It's about what they're trying to get away with, and whether the FIA has the resolve to stop it before it's too late. Formula One is built on ambiguity. The regulations don't describe how to win, they describe how not to get caught. And in that space between what's written and what's implied, teams like Red Bull have always thrived. The 2026 engine rules, meant to simplify and equalize the power units across all manufacturers, were supposed to limit the kinds of exploits that defined previous eras. But instead of closing loopholes, they've created a new battlefield: energy flow manipulation within undefined thermal tolerances. And it's here that Red Bull has planted their flag, not in open defiance, but in strategic ambiguity. At the heart of the issue is a phrase that's both vague and powerful: the spirit of the regulation. It doesn't exist in the written rulebook, but it governs everything. It's what Mercedes used to defend DAS. What Ferrari invoked in 2018 to justify oil burn. What Renault clung to in their brake bias controversy. And now, Red Bull is using it to push the limits of pre-combustion pressure behavior, technically within the fuel flow cap, technically within the hybrid integration envelope, but unmistakably engineered for a momentary power spike. A trick of timing, not hardware. From a regulatory standpoint, Red Bull is safe for now. The combustion staging they're reportedly exploiting hasn't been formally banned. The current FIA documentation defines energy deployment and recovery windows, but it does not account for phased ignition behavior tied to pressure layers. Why? Because no one expected a team to attempt it. It wasn't anticipated, because it wasn't supposed to be physically viable under the new budget constraints. That's the brilliance of Red Bull's move. They're betting on complexity as camouflage. But that bet carries enormous risk. Because the moment their competitors convince the FIA that this design undermines the intention of performance parity, it triggers a familiar chain reaction. Clarification requests become technical directives. Technical directives become mid-season rulings. And if the ruling arrives before the engine is homologated, Red Bull will be forced to redesign the core of their power unit. Not just adjust a full strategic pivot. And unlike aerodynamics, you don't fix combustion behavior with a new wing. You rebuild everything from the crankshaft outward. What's even more delicate is that the FIA doesn't want another credibility crisis. After the secret agreement with Ferrari in 2019, after the backlash to Mercedes' DAS ban, after the porpoising fiasco of 2022, they know how fragile public trust is. If they move too quickly, it looks like favoritism. If they wait too long, it looks like negligence. And Red Bull is using that hesitation as a shield. Because the longer they operate in silence, the more time they have to develop a system that is both fast and deniable. A weapon dressed as compliance. The FIA is caught in a political trap. If they rule against Red Bull now, they'll be accused of punishing innovation. If they wait until 2025, they risk letting Red Bull dominate testing with an engine that will be unmatchable under final regulations. That puts enormous pressure on a governing body that has historically struggled to keep up with engineering creativity. And Red Bull knows this. They've seen it before. They understand the rhythm. The first leak causes chaos. The second leak draws the spotlight. But the third? That's the one that forces the FIA's hand. And yet, nothing is certain. The FIA hasn't ruled. The rivals haven't protested. Red Bull hasn't spoken. The engine remains under development, shielded from public view, protected by timing and ambiguity. But if history is any guide, this isn't sustainable. Gray areas don't stay gray forever. At some point, someone will force the definition to shift, and when it does, someone's championship window may close before a single wheel is turned.